The shadow of the courtyard wall pressed heavily against my spine, the jagged, damp stone biting right through the thin fabric of my coat. I stood perfectly still in the freezing night air, letting the darkness swallow my silhouette. My phone vibrated furiously in my palm, throwing a harsh artificial blue light over the slick cobblestones beneath my heels. A fresh notification sat on the glowing screen, sent straight from the heated luxury of the VIP bridal suite 3 floors above me. Use the service entrance and stay in the kitchen. Your cheap clothes will ruin my photos. Do not expect me to acknowledge you tonight. I read the words twice, letting the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the message wash over me. A hired string quartet echoed through the massive stained glass windows of the grand ballroom, playing a soft, elegant waltz that completely mocked the venom glowing on my screen. I traced the cracked edge of my phone case with my thumb. She typed those exact words with steady, manicured hands, completely certain she was shoving her embarrassing younger sister into the dark. She thought I was about to cower among the aluminum catering trays while she played queen for her lavish 10-year vow renewal. She had absolutely no idea. The heavy notarized deed resting quietly in the inner pocket of my coat proved otherwise. That single piece of paper made me the sole legal owner of this $5 million estate. The courtyard air smelled of damp earth, expensive perfume, and roasted catering meats. At 28 years old, I had spent my entire adult life as a public high school teacher right here in Sacramento. I managed entitled bullies, broke up cafeteria fights, and navigated teenage meltdowns every single day for a living. I thought I had seen every possible variation of human cruelty. But absolutely none of my students ever matched the sheer calculated, cold-blooded malice of my older sister Valerie. Valerie was the golden child. She was the absolute center of our family universe, a black hole that swallowed all the attention, resources, and praise. I was the invisible scapegoat expected to sweep up the confetti after her parades and stay entirely out of the frame. The contrast between us was carved in stone from the moment we were old enough to speak. 5 years ago, the fluorescent lights of a Sacramento emergency room hummed heavily over my head, casting a sickly yellow pallor over everything. The air smelled of sharp, antiseptic, stale waiting room coffee and quiet desperation. I spent 48 agonizing hours slumped in a stiff, molded plastic hospital chair. My back ached, my eyes burned from exhaustion, and I gripped our mother's frail, bruised hand while she drifted in and out of a medically induced sleep. I was utterly terrified. My mother's heart was failing, and the doctors were offering 0 guarantees. Valerie promised me she was handling the family logistics. She promised she was dealing with the insurance, paying the utility bills, and keeping the house running while I kept the hospital vigil. I believed her. I trusted my own flesh and blood. A month later, after our mother stabilized and returned home, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail from our late grandmother's estate lawyer. I tore it open on the kitchen counter, expecting the transfer documents for the $50,000 trust our grandmother had explicitly left to me. That money was my absolute lifeline. It was legally designated to pay off my crushing student loans and fund my advanced teaching credentials. I desperately needed it to survive the coming decade. Instead, I stared at a final closing statement. The trust account was completely, utterly empty. Attached to the back of the packet was a withdrawal slip bearing my signature, except I never held the pen. While I was feeding our mother ice chips in the hospital, listening to the steady beep of her heart monitor, Valerie was sitting in a plush leather chair in a notary's office across town. She forged my name with absolute precision. She liquidated my entire future with one effortless, sweeping pen stroke. She took my $50,000 and drove straight to a luxury car dealership in the wealthiest zip code she could find. She bought a massive top-of-the-line imported SUV and slapped an enormous down payment on a lifestyle she completely lacked the income to support. The confrontation still burns in my memory, a hot ember of injustice that never quite cools. I stood in our mother's living room, my knuckles entirely white as I gripped the fraudulent bank statements. I slammed the papers onto the glass coffee table, the sound shattering the quiet Sunday afternoon. Valerie did not flinch. She did not drop her gaze, and she certainly did not apologize. She simply rolled her perfectly manicured eyes, tossed her shiny new leather-bound car keys onto the granite counter, and let out a long, exaggerated sigh. "You are just a public school teacher, Kelsey," she said, her voice dripping with venomous pity. "You do not need real money. I have a high society image to maintain. You should be happy for me." I turned to our mother, begging for her to intervene. I pleaded for a single shred of justice, a single ounce of maternal protection. My mother just tightened her grip on her porcelain teacup. She refused to meet my gaze, staring fixedly at the television screen, and whispered her final verdict. "Kelsey, please. Your sister needs the car for her social circle. Do not cause unnecessary family drama." Family drama. They called a blatant felony fraud family drama. They completely broke my spirit that afternoon. They left me drowning in compounding debt, entirely isolated, and suffocating under the crushing weight of their shared entitlement. They expected me to simply swallow the betrayal, bow my head, and fade away into my quiet, broke, unremarkable life. But tonight, standing outside the massive stone walls of the vineyard, the cold wind felt absolutely incredible. My fingers traced the raised seal on the $5 million deed in my pocket. They thought they buried me 5 years ago. They completely forgot that I am a seed. I never hired a lawyer to chase the stolen money back then. I knew that $50,000 was already burned on premium leather interiors, custom exhaust pipes, and endless rounds of country club mimosas. Dragging my own sister into a courtroom would have only painted me as the bitter, jealous, unhinged sibling in their twisted family mythology. They would have played the victims flawlessly. So, I walked away. I swallowed the massive injustice and weaponized my absolute burning rage. I worked grueling teaching shifts. I managed teenage meltdowns, broke up fights, and stood on my feet for 9 hours a day. Then I came home and graded history essays until 2 in the morning. When the grading was finally done, my real work started. I scoured public foreclosure listings under the harsh, eye-straining glow of my laptop screen. I scraped together every spare cent lived off instant oatmeal and tap water and bought a decaying, abandoned duplex on the absolute worst edge of town. A year later, I flipped the duplex and bought a failing commercial strip. I spent my weekends tearing out moldy drywall with my bare hands. I hauled heavy trash bags of rotting insulation until my palms bled, while my sister drank imported champagne on luxury weekend getaways funded by credit card debt. Over the next 5 years, I built a highly lucrative property management firm entirely in the shadows. My portfolio expanded across the county, a silent empire built on concrete sweat and pure grit. But to Valerie, I remained the pathetic, destitute public servant. At mandatory family dinners, she would sit across the table, tapping her massive diamond rings against her crystal wine glass. She would loudly, obnoxiously offer to buy my groceries. She would openly mock my sensible shoes and tell our extended relatives that I completely lacked the drive to succeed in the real world. I just smiled politely and passed the mashed potatoes. I let her talk, knowing the quiet holding companies attached to my name held a liquid net worth that tripled hers. Then came the grand spectacle, her 10-year vow renewal. Valerie spent 6 exhausting months bragging endlessly about securing the most exclusive luxury vineyard in Sacramento County. It was a massive, sprawling stone estate famous for hosting elite politicians and billionaire tech executives. She mailed out heavy gold foil invitations and demanded everyone wear black tie attire to match her carefully curated, entirely fake aesthetic. She wanted to prove to Sacramento high society that she was entirely untouchable. But Valerie only cared about the glossy surface of things. She never bothered to look at the financial foundation beneath the stone. My commercial real estate alerts pinged on a quiet Tuesday morning. That breathtaking, ultra-exclusive vineyard was quietly suffocating in severe, insurmountable corporate debt. The original owners had completely defaulted on their massive loans, and the bank was quietly liquidating the asset to avoid a messy, highly public bankruptcy scandal. I recognized the kill shot immediately. The universe was handing me the hammer. I leveraged the massive equity from my commercial properties and secured a rapid hard money loan. I bypassed the grueling standard real estate bureaucracy entirely. Acting exclusively through an anonymous limited liability company, I purchased the vineyard's distressed debt at a private commercial auction. The ink dried. The transfer was absolute. Exactly 3 days before Valerie's massive celebration, I assumed full executive control of the foreclosed estate. I legally owned the soil she planned to walk, on the stone walls she planned to photograph, and the very doors she was about to shut in my face. I kept my name entirely off the public radar, holding my breath in the dark, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike the match. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my heels as I stood outside the massive iron gates of the estate. The night air was sharp, carrying the rich scent of crushed grapes and expensive heavy perfume. Inside the main building, Valerie's 10-year vow renewal was in full swing, a loud, chaotic symphony of clinking glasses and forced laughter. My phone vibrated furiously in my coat pocket. It was a relentless, angry rhythm against my thigh. I pulled the device out. 5 new texts from Valerie glared back at me in harsh white bubbles, illuminating the dark courtyard. The in-laws are arriving. Do not come out of the kitchen. I mean it, Kelsey. Stay by the catering prep tables. You are lucky I even let you on the property. Do not embarrass me tonight. She was unraveling. Valerie spent her entire life carefully curating a flawless high society image, and my mere existence threatened the fragile illusion. She desperately needed to lock me away in the shadows to prove to her wealthy Sacramento guests that she belonged on a pedestal high above the struggles of normal people. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The glass felt cold against my fingertips. For 5 years, I played the exact role she assigned me. I kept my head down. I wore the sensible shoes. I swallowed the daily insults at family dinners and let her parade around in the luxury vehicle she bought with my stolen future. She demanded a broke, pathetic scapegoat, and I let her believe she had successfully created one. My fingers gripped the lapels of my thick, oversized wool coat. The heavy, dark fabric concealed absolutely everything. I unbuttoned the collar and let the coat slide off my shoulders. It hit the cobblestone path with a soft thud, a quiet surrender of the disguise I had worn for half a decade. The biting wind rushed over my bare arms. I was wearing a floor-length, custom-tailored emerald silk gown. The expensive fabric poured over my silhouette like liquid glass, clinging perkly to every curve. The intricate hand-sewn beadwork caught the dim courtyard lighting, throwing tiny, brilliant sparks into the dark. This dress cost more than the original down payment on the SUV Valerie stole from me. I bought it in cash simply because I wanted to. I stepped right over the discarded coat. A harried event coordinator rushed past me, clutching a clipboard to her chest. She pointed a frantic finger toward a narrow, poorly lit wooden door near the dumpsters. Catering staff and extended family through the service entrance, please. Hurry up. I ignored her completely. I turned my back on the service door and walked straight up the grand stone staircase toward the main entrance. 2 tuxedo-clad ushers scrambled to block my path, their hands raised in immediate panic. One look at the cold, absolutely unyielding expression on my face stopped them dead in their tracks. They lowered their hands, stepped aside, and pulled the massive brass-studded double doors wide open. The transition from the cold, dark courtyard into the blinding warmth of the ballroom hit like a physical wave. Massive crystal chandeliers blazed from the vaulted ceilings, casting a harsh golden glow over hundreds of Sacramento's most elite socialites. Waiters circulated through the crowd with silver trays of expensive champagne. Valerie's arrogant in-laws stood near a towering ice sculpture, laughing loudly at a joke I could not hear. I stepped across the threshold. My velvet heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. I walked directly past the velvet-roped reception tables. I walked past the sprawling, obscenely expensive floral arrangements. I walked to the absolute dead center of the ballroom, directly under the largest chandelier, and planted my feet on my own floor. The string quartet hit a sour note and stopped completely. Conversations nearby abruptly halted. Wealthy guests turned their heads, their champagne flutes hovering frozen near their mouths. They stared at the emerald silk. They stared at my absolute terrifying stillness. And then, across the sprawling sea of designer tuxedos and rented jewelry, Valerie spotted me. The color drained completely from Valerie's cheeks, instantly replaced by a flush of violent, unhinged red. She shoved past a waiter, nearly knocking a silver tray to the floor. Her heavy satin wedding dress swished aggressively against the marble as she marched toward the center of the room. She refused to pull me aside for a quiet, sisterly chat. She wanted a highly public execution. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the very people she worshipped. She stopped mere inches from my face. Her jaw tightened into a vicious knot, the muscles jumping beneath her expensive foundation. But when she turned her head to look at the head of estate security hovering near the ice sculpture, she instantly weaponized her tears. "Get her out of here," Valerie commanded, her voice trembling with perfectly faked, breathless terror. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my chest. "That woman is completely deranged. She has a history of stalking my husband, and she is not on the guest list. Remove her immediately before she hurts someone." The burly security guard stepped forward, his massive hand reaching for my bare arm. The room held its collective breath. I raised my palm. I held the guard's gaze, absolutely unblinking, projecting a wall of quiet authority until he froze in his tracks. "Stand down," I ordered. My voice was quiet, completely devoid of yelling, but every single word hit the deafening silence like a hammer striking an anvil. Valerie let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly across the marble. "You do not give orders here, Kelsey. You are a broke, pathetic squatter. Throw her out." I unclasped my sleek evening clutch. I slid the thick notarized document from inside and pressed it flat against the broad chest of the security guard. "Valerie thought I was weak," I said, locking eyes with my older sister as the smug superiority on her face began to violently falter. She forgot that I deal with entitled, tantrum-throwing bullies every single day for a living. The guard's eyes scanned the heavy legal seal, the bold, undeniable print of the county clerk, and my name stamped at the very top of the page. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He took a massive step back, immediately lowering his radio. "I am the legal owner of this estate," I announced. My voice carried effortlessly across the dead-silent ballroom, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. The previous owners defaulted on their loans. I bought the distress debt in cash 3 days ago, which means every square inch of this property from the gates to the wine cellar belongs to me. I turned my head to the sound engineer, frozen by the massive speakers in the corner. "Cut the music." The faint hum of the amplifiers died. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed was deafening. "The event is canceled," I declared, turning my eyes back to Valerie, delivering the absolute final blow. "You are officially trespassing on my property. Get out." The ash-white terror struck Valerie like a physical blow to the sternum. The toxic arrogance melted entirely off her bones, leaving behind raw, naked, pathetic panic. She stared at the paper in the guard's hand. She did the math in real time. Her brain completely short-circuited under the crushing weight of the reversal. Apologies require a conscience. Valerie possessed none. Instead of begging for forgiveness, she suffered a massive, spectacular, narcissistic collapse right there on the dance floor. "No," Valerie shrieked, the ugly sound tearing through her throat. She spun around wildly, frantically grabbing her husband's tuxedo jacket. "Do something! She is lying! Tell them she is lying! Fix this!" Her husband stared at her, his face a mask of utter disgust and humiliation. He peeled her manicured fingers off his lapels one by one. He took a long, deliberate step backward, physically and permanently severing his ties to her madness. The crowd erupted in audible gasps. Wealthy guests pulled out their phones, screens glowing brightly in the dim light, as they recorded the complete, irreversible implosion of Sacramento's most desperate socialite. Valerie lashed out like a cornered animal. She screamed viciously at the caterers. She blamed her husband for failing to protect her. She hurled a crystal champagne flute violently at the marble floor. The glass shattered into 100 pieces. Absolutely no one flinched. They just watched her drown in her own making. I stood perfectly still in my emerald silk, my breathing slow and steady, watching the monster who stole my future choke entirely on her own poison. The massive ballroom cleared out in less than 20 minutes. Valets scrambled frantically in the courtyard to fetch luxury cars, while Sacramento's elite whispered their way out the massive double doors, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The string quartet packed their cellos and violins in dead, uncomfortable silence. It looked exactly like a surrender, but I survived 28 years under Valerie's roof. I knew the twisted, vindictive DNA running through her veins better than anyone on Earth. She refused to walk away quietly. Her ego simply would not allow it. She demanded a pound of flesh to balance the scales of her humiliation. I left the empty ballroom and walked down the long carpeted hallway to the estate's security center. 2 dispatched Sacramento police officers were already waiting inside the dimly lit room holding paper coffee cups. I stood right behind them, my arms crossed over my chest, watching the glowing grid of security monitors on the wall. Camera 4 flickered. Valerie slipped through the catering doors, which had been wedged open by the fleeing kitchen staff. Her expensive satin wedding gown dragged through spilled red wine and crushed appetizers on the floor. She marched straight toward the main barrel room and yanked violently on the heavy iron handles. The smart locks flashed a hard, unforgiving red light. Access denied. Furious and completely unhinged, she pivoted toward the adjacent VIP tasting lounge. The heavy mahogany doors swung open easily. Inside, floor-to-ceiling glass display cases housed hundreds of rare vintage wine bottles. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars in fragile, uninsured inventory. Valerie marched directly to the massive stone hearth. Her shaking fingers curled around a solid brass fire poker. She gripped the metal with both hands, lifting the heavy weapon above her shoulder. Black mascara ran down her pale cheeks in thick, ugly streaks. She aimed the brass tip directly at the center of the largest glass display. She wanted to shatter my investment. She wanted to drown my victory in broken glass and spilled wine. Now I told the officers. Before Valerie could swing the heavy poker forward, the heavy oak doors of the lounge flew open. Drop the weapon, Sacramento PD. Blinding white flashlights hit Valerie directly in the face. She froze, caught completely off guard. The heavy brass poker slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the stone hearth. The officers moved in immediately. They spun her around roughly and shoved her wrists behind her back. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the pristine tasting room. I stepped through the doorway, my emerald gown gliding over the floorboards. Valerie sobbed loudly, not out of remorse for what she had done, but out of pure, unadulterated humiliation at being caught. She thrashed wildly against the officer's grip, desperately searching the hallway behind me for her husband. He stood near the courtyard exit, holding his car keys. He took one long, disgusted look at his wife struggling in police custody, turned his back and walked out to the valet stand. He officially severed the knot. My mother hovered near the entrance of the lounge, clutching her expensive woven shawl. She bypassed any form of a genuine apology. She ignored the steel handcuffs completely. Instead, she wrung her trembling hands and whined exactly as she had 5 years ago. "Kelsey, please. Tell them to stop. You are ruining your sister's night." I looked at the woman who enabled my abuse for decades. The woman who sat in a chair and watched Valerie steal my future, only to tell me to stay quiet and keep the peace. She ruined her own night. "Mom," I said, my voice perfectly steady and cold, "and she is going to jail." The officers hauled Valerie out through the main doors. Flashing red and blue cruiser lights painted the stone vineyard walls in chaotic colors. I stood on the grand staircase and watched the taillights disappear down the long gravel driveway. The massive estate fell completely quiet. For the first time in my entire life, I breathed in the cold night air and felt absolute unbreakable peace. Valerie's criminal trial was remarkably brief. Stripped of her high society enablers and faced with a mountain of undeniable time-stamped financial evidence, her arrogant facade entirely crumbled. The judge showed zero leniency, sentencing her to 4 years in a state penitentiary and ordering mandatory restitution of $250,000. The social and personal fallout was absolute. Her husband filed for divorce the very next morning, freezing their assets, changing the locks, and walking away without looking back. Sacramento's elite immediately erased her from their country clubs and social feeds, as if she had never existed. Meanwhile, our mother wept in the gallery, finally getting the public family drama she had quietly enabled for decades. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind swept through my thriving vineyard. I was sitting at my heavy oak desk when my assistant handed me a flimsy white envelope stamped with the official blue seal of the California Department of Corrections. Inside, Valerie's rushed ink was smeared across unlined paper. It was a masterclass in inverted reality. She didn't apologize for stealing my money or for the years of psychological torment. Instead, she weaponized her own misery, blaming me for her current environment and demanding I petition the parole board for the family. She genuinely believed the invisible strings of blood obligations still controlled my hands. My pulse remained perfectly steady. I didn't feel a sudden spike of adrenaline or a single shred of misplaced guilt. I calmly folded her toxic delusion, walked over to my heavy-duty office shredder, and fed the paper into the steel blades. The machine hummed, a quiet, efficient rhythm, turning her manipulation into unreadable confetti. I gave her the only response: a narcissist truly fears absolute permanent silence. That evening, the grand ballroom of the vineyard echoed with genuine, unrestrained laughter. I hosted a private harvest dinner, but there were no pretentious ice sculptures and no toxic blood relatives sitting at my table. Instead, I broke bread with my chosen family, my brilliant lead property manager, the high school principal who mentored me through my darkest years, and the friends who brought me cheap takeout when I was grading essays at 2 in the prom. Morning. Looking down the long candlelit table, the suffocating anxiety that defined my past was permanently gone. I was finally breathing clean air. If you are suffocating under the weight of a dysfunctional family, hear me very clearly. Arguing only fuels a narcissist. They crave your emotional reaction because it proves they still control your nervous system. Starve them with your silence. Blood is nothing more than a random genetic accident, but loyalty is a daily, deliberate choice. Setting a hard boundary isn't a betrayal of your family. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. And the greatest revenge isn't ruining the people who hurt you, it's rendering them completely irrelevant to your daily peace. I didn't win because Valerie went to prison. I won because I built a fortress she could not afford to enter. Take your bricks, walk into the shadows, and build your own empire.